This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Okay, let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Previously on the Master Brewers Podcast.
Low beta-glucans indicate that you have a product that came out of a patient and completed malting process. You can't rush the malting process and come up with a low beta-glucan.
Welcome back. I'm John Bryce, and we're back today with part 3 of simplifying the understanding of malt certificates of analysis. If you're new here, you'll want to go back and listen to episode 15 first. Now let's jump back into the conversation with Joe.
I'm moving too fast, and then I fall on the ground.
So, when we get down through here, John, there's another thing I want to mention for the benefit of craft brewers is I'm going to mention Fribila Meters, because if you have a wet chemistry lab and you can get S over T ratios or Kolbachs, and you can get beta-glucan, you don't necessarily have to have a Fribila meter. But a Fribila meter is a real useful tool if you don't have a wet chemistry lab, or if you want to have your maltster report friability meter. And sometimes you can get a friability result easier than you can get a maltster to report a beta-glucan result. Now, friability meters they're valuable because think of it as a functional analysis of the whole malt system instead of an individual analysis for protein modification and an individual analysis for carbohydrate modification. This is sort of the comprehensive measure of modification. Does the whole malt work as a system? So they're relatively simple devices, and I think it's more likely that maybe a craft brewer would have a friability meter instead of a wet chemistry lab. The other thing that craft brewers should prepare for probably is most craft maltsters will not have a full wet chemistry lab and will not be reporting Kolbach ratios and beta-glucan. But it's relatively simpler for them to not have a full chemistry lab and have a friability meter to evaluate their results. But they're very useful, and
they're pretty inexpensive too, aren't they? What, like around $3 or $4 grand or something?
No, I think they're maybe closer to 8.
Oh, okay.
I think it's closer to 8 maybe for the puffer, the industry standard. There may be other manufacturers of them, but the ones that I'm familiar with, they're in that area of $8,000. But the place where the place where they're most useful is to think about two things. You can get a comprehensive view of modification without a wet chemistry profile, and it's a consolidated modification. It tells you about the malt, protein, and carbohydrate as a system instead of looking at individual components. So I have to point out one other thing that's very important, and that is that modification profiles, when you talk about things like S over T ratio and beta-glucan, they are very variety dependent. In other words, there's this concept of protein modification must penetrate and free the extract cell wall material to allow the glucanases to get at the beta-glucan. That varies by variety, and it's a hard thing to understand for some brewers that look at maybe an expectation of one S over T is the correct S over T. You can't apply that. There's not one S over T that's exactly right for every variety. And it probably explains a lot about the way people feel about different varieties. In Europe, the breeding programs in Germany, in the UK, they still have as a goal, they do not want any variety that requires higher than about a 40 S over T to allow penetration and to reduce the beta-glucan. Now, in the United States, our varieties have evolved quite a bit. When up until the early 70s, we didn't have any two-row breeding in the United States. We only had varieties that were brought here and adapted and grew, and they were European two-rows. And when I started in brewing, the predominant two-rows were Hanschen and Pirelin and Betze. They were all European varieties that were brought here. Clogus was the first North American breeding effort, followed by Harrington. Now, those varieties that came from Europe look just like varieties in Europe look today. You could get a very good modification on a 38 to 40 S over T. You had much lower enzymes. The DP on those malts was 95 and maybe a 25 alpha, very, very different, and they took 5 days or 6 days to malt. But the two rows that we have in the United States are very different. And if for instance, the standard that we had for many years, Harrington, could be modified at relatively low beta glucan in the S over T range at 42 to 44. So that was acceptable, and most of the craft brewers that started in the 80s and 90s, that was their standard. However, today, a predominant two-row AC Metcalf, it has to be modified to 46 or 48 S over T to get at the beta-glucan to reduce it. And if you don't take the protein modification to that level, the beta-glucan is not going to come down. And I think a couple other varieties, it explains probably why a lot of craft brewers like Copeland more than they like Metcalf. Copeland still has a relatively modest profile like Harrington, and you can get a good modification and a low beta glucan in that 42 to 44 range. So people tend to look at Copeland as a little bit quieter variety than Metcalf. And the reason that people don't like the higher modification varieties is they will produce higher fan, higher soluble protein. There'll be more artifacts to give you a higher color on the kiln. But the point that I want to make sure I get across is there's no one S over T that is correct for every single variety. If you picked a number, 44 S over T, I can give you varieties that are over-modified at 44, and I can give you varieties that are under-modified at 44. A recent experience that I think brewers have had in this area is why brewers pretty much rejected the new variety Meredith recently. Are you familiar with Meredith, John? It was a relatively new variety in Canada, and the reason that, and now I just received my recommended varieties for 2017 in Canada, and Meredith has been dropped from the list.
Dropped off, huh? Yeah.
Yep, it's dropped off now. Now, the reason for that, it required another stretch in S over T. It had to be protein modified to at least 50 to break through to get to the beta-glucan reduction, and it was just people thought that it just created too much protein modification artifact, too much soluble protein, too much fan, and they were rejecting it on that basis. Again, the point I want to leave with everybody is there's no one single number, and if you look at that's correct, and if you look at the simple math of protein and soluble total and ratio, you realize that you can't come up with three independent numbers. They are mathematically linked. And if you take the concept that total protein is delivered to us by nature, and it's going to be the average in the crop that's delivered by rainfall and climate each year, and we can't modify that when we get it to the malt house. And if you take then the concept that the ratio is an indication of modification, and you must observe good modification to get good functional malt, well, then the fallout from that is soluble protein. And if you have a variety that requires a higher S over T to completely make it functional, and you're in a high protein year for total protein, you're going to have some high soluble proteins in your malt. But my point is you have to accept that, because the alternative is to instruct the maltster to reduce the modification to give you a lower soluble protein, and you're going to have a range of negative outcomes from less functional malt. So it's important.
Joe, does that, important, on a very high level, you know, why SOT S over T is, changes is different for different varieties. Would it be a factor going back to just the breakdown of the different types of protein that are inherent with a different variety? Is that a factor here?
Yeah, I don't know. I know it seems to be a genetic trait, and that and I don't know about the spectrum of proteins that become soluble, John. I do know that that's probably that's the biggest unexplored area. We're satisfied of dividing it up into insoluble and soluble, but the division of soluble, of how you control the amount of small amino groups and foaming proteins and flavor proteins. Remember that it's an enzyme function. As you keep pushing out, as you keep pushing out to get the S over T higher and bring insoluble over to soluble, the enzymes at the same time are chopping up within the soluble, and it's reducing it to the lowest common diameter.
Right.
And left to go to its extreme, you'd end up with all amine groups. And that's why people that object to high S over T's, they object to it on the basis that you're destroying foaming proteins and you're creating too much FAN. Right. That's going to be a hindrance in the process. But it's a balance. And to me, you have to find functional balance. You have to find how to get functional malt. My argument with people usually is you look at the soluble protein, you look at the modification requirement. If you don't like the outcome, don't try to change the degree of modification. Pick another variety. And I think that's what people do when they say, I don't really want Metcalf, I'd rather have Copeland. Or when they say, I'm going to reject Meredith and I'm not going to buy it at all, and it drops off the approved list. I think that's what they're really saying.
We'll pick up the final part of this conversation next week on episode 18, where Joe summarizes the most critical parameters on a malt analysis.
Okay, let's go!
I learn more each time I hear Joe speak. Would you like to spend all day with Joe in a classroom? Enroll in the always sold-out 2-week MBAA Brewing and Malting Science course. This year, 6 brewers attended free of charge on Master Brewers scholarships. Click the Education tab at mbaa.com to learn more. If you're still not a Master Brewers member, you're really missing out. Use discount code 4094 to save $15 on professional membership if you join by December 31st. Just visit the membership tab at mbaa.com.
2 things that you should have known, and maybe 3 things that I should have mentioned, but I did. My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much.